This is What's Left America, and I'm Chris Tritico.
I'm Andi Georgsson.
I'm James Campbell.
And I'm Chris Bell.
What's Left America is proudly produced by Left Out Media and brought to you by the generosity of our sponsors and friends like the Houston Federation of Teachers, Local 2415 AFL-CIO, and Stoli Vodka, and hopefully someday friends just like you. Today we're going to cover the paper-thin president. It's a truly white house, the race card, and Don McGahn, rat or patriot. And, of course, we'll close the show, like always, with Out of Left Field. We're going to get right into it. The paper-thin president. You know, last week, the president revoked the security clearance of John Brennan, and this had been in the works for months. They actually wrote up the paperwork months ago. The president sat on it until he thought that the timing was right to divert the attention of the country away from something. So Omarosa comes out with her book, and he thought that he needed it. So he pulls this out, revokes Brennan's security clearance, claiming that he is monetizing his security clearance and tries to divert the country away from Omarosa because he can't handle what she's doing. It's really what this is all about.
So you think that was a diversion? And
there's no question.
So this is what I think. We all know that Trump can't stand people to criticize him, and someone of John Brennan's authority and credibility really burns him up to go out and talk about Trump and collusion. But Trump thinks that these guys have the security clearances as a matter of courtesy. They have those security clearances for a reason, because presidents and security people who are now with this current administration consult with guys like Brennan and Clapper because they understand what they're going through and can advise them.
Well, they keep it as a matter of courtesy so that they can advise the people that follow them.
Yes.
That's all true. But the reason he did it this week was purely to divert attention. It's wrong, and he attacked.
It had been decided weeks ago, and so then they just held it like a card to
and they're holding these
throw
other
out if they were having a bad press week.
And holding the other ones to do the same thing.
Well, you know what? I give credit to the media then for focusing on Omarosa rather than Brennan losing his security clearance. That's a focus that they should look at, but you know, the American people have gotten used to this game, and they know when Trump goes into his diversionary tactics, and this is just one of his diversionary tactics, but I think that the Brennan story is more important than Omarosa, but it depends on what Omarosa happened. We're going to talk about that later.
We're going to get into Omarosa.
Yeah, I agree with you, James, that the clearances story is the more important story, but I think that the press has also learned how to deal with these distractions. You know, when Trump throws something out to take the press's eye off the ball over on the other side. But I think that the news media did a good job this week focusing on both stories.
Yeah.
Well, I think they're learning the game too.
Right.
Yeah.
But this has never been used as a political tool. And what I found to be somewhat incredible was that many former heads of the CIA were willing to get together and say this is wrong. Simply wrong. And a lot of them, or several of them, said we don't necessarily agree with what Brennan has been doing or what he's been saying, but you just don't use security clearances as yet another political tool.
A tool to stifle free speech. Then that's exactly what the president's doing. And Bruce Orr is an example of why the president is using this to stifle free speech. Bruce Orr still works for the government, and he's going to cancel his security clearance because of Bruce Orr's wife worked for the company that made the Steele dossier.
Well, at least they have a good reason.
What? Really?
I mean,
really?
No, okay.
That's
but
no
apparently
reason.
There's a whole list of folks, and that they're going to throw them out whenever they're having the bad press week, like you pointed out earlier.
Yeah.
We'll throw out someone we're jerking their national security clearance so we can say, hey, look over there.
So if it wasn't just to attack people that were critical of him, let's just throw this into the mix. He has not President Trump has not revoked Michael Flynn's security clearance. He's only seen fit to suspend his. Now, you remember Michael Flynn. He pled guilty to a felony. Okay, his has only been suspended, but these other people are going to have theirs revoked. So tell me how that is not in line with what I'm saying here today, that he is only attacking people who are critical of him.
Well, the president is nothing if not vindictive, and John Brennan has a Twitter feed that is out of this world. He's one of the very few people in one of the intelligence agencies or a person high enough to know something about what's going on with this Mueller investigation, and he is talked back to the president. He said in response to Trump's calling Omarosa a dog on Twitter that the president isn't presidential. He is having a harmful impact on our young people, and he will never understand how to be a decent person, either in the White House or personally. So I get why he wanted to revoke that clearance. The problem is that he uses it. Because he has shown his willingness to do this, it is a threat to anyone who might want to or has evidence that they might want to give to the Mueller investigation. And he uses that in the same way he uses pardons as an incentive to other people not to flip.
Well, and see, Chris, that's your problem. You keep trying to act like this president is going to be somewhat comparable to legitimate presidents and presidents that we've admired in the past, and the way they conduct themselves
he did
with
say
the
your
questions
name.
that you raise.
That was her. The questions I'm asking. Yeah.
That said, why?
I'm just trying to get y'all to talk about
It's the premise of your questions.
No, I know that, but
Chris
as
Tritico.
Andi correctly points out, Michael Flynn has information a great deal, so surely you're not going to jerk his security clearance. They have standards over there.
That's right.
But when we started this show, I talked about how Trump played his way, the dozens, that's the street chatter in the hood, all the way to the White House. And now he's basically said to Brennan, I'm taking your ball away from you and going home. And this president does not understand that these guys need these clearances for a reason, Chris.
He doesn't care. He understands. He doesn't care. That's the difference.
But what I thought was funny, the list that they have put together that they're going to jerk security clearances later, it's doubtful some of them even have the security clearance.
Or really care.
He'll have nothing to take away.
Or care about it. William H. McRaven.
As a lawyer, the former counsel for the CIA, a guy named Jeffrey Smith, wrote an op-ed that contends that Trump is violating Brennan's First Amendment right by taking away this clearance and basically saying, shut up. Wow. But he's also taking away this guy's livelihood because he may need that clearance to be able to go and work in a house.
I don't really give a rat's ass about that. That's his problem. But there are.
Well, tell me what you really think, my sister. Wow.
The deal is that some of these people have real expertise, and if they're not, if no one's able to read them into a situation, then they're not going to be able to offer that expertise.
Yes.
Also, speaking of distractions. It's interesting in this presidency, this kind of bullshit is the only thing we talk about. He's supposed to be building a wall and repealing Obamacare and deporting every Mexican living in the United States. Where does he find the time to do any of that?
When he's getting back at everybody.
So I'm working real hard this week because I listened to last week's show and I used extraordinary about 33 times during the course because everything I see in this administration is so extraordinary. But so Brennan, he just takes away his national security clearance because he's saying nasty things about him on television and on Twitter and what have you. But then the Bruce Orr example, he's maybe part of an investigation.
Right.
So now you're not just talking about speech, but you're talking about obstruction of justice, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
But we talked earlier about this distraction, and we talked about how the media is learning how to like deal with that. And you have to look at the chattering class. Those are the people, the pundits who go on cable news and shout at each other. And you have to look at newspapers and what they cover. And newspapers, for the most part, have been able to walk and chew gum at the same time and cover different stories. But, you know, I thought it was a real interesting juxtaposition last week when this happened and Aretha Franklin died,
Right.
and on the front pages of every USA Today, Wall Street Journal, New York Times was the Queen of Soul, and in that left box, Donald Trump and John
I don't even
Brennan.
think the president even
But you're
mentioned
not
that.
suggesting the Trump administration had
Well,
anything to do with Aretha's
He-
death, are
he,
you?
he did mention that Aretha worked for him. You know,
When?
So, he was trying to give a sympathetic word about
Yeah,
Aretha
yeah.
dying.
He cannot just say
Work for him
rest
where?
in peace. He said, "Oh, Aretha Franklin, she was great. You know, she
That's all
worked
I
for
saw.
me. I thought she was awesome.
Yeah.
What, can he just like fix his fingers just to
Instead-
say
he doesn't have the
Instead
ability.
of, instead
to
of
do
just
that.
honoring this great
It's all
singer
about
who
him.
did so much. So here, did y'all read the Donnie Dooch? I guess is how you say this
That
guy's
was
name.
hilarious.
This guy, I think a friend of the president says that his ego is so fragile. The Secret Service acts as his fluffers. They come into events.
Bell, you know
Come-
what fluff
I don't know
I
what
did.
that
You
is.
watched a few Stormy Daniels movies.
Come into events ahead of the president and make contact with anybody who's going to make contact with the president. They say, hey, when you see the president, you got to say positive things, pump him up, because he cannot be in a room where people are not saying positive things to him.
Well, the pump him up would be in line with being a fluffer. I mean, that's the
funniest
whole-
thing I have ever read, that the president of the United States cannot have anyone say anything negative in his
But
presence.
that smells of a slight bit of bullshit to me. I just cannot see the Secret Service. You've seen those guys, those most humorless fucks that have ever walked the face of the earth. I can't see them going in, hey, get excited, everybody.
That
The
was-
president's coming in.
That was Chris Bell who said that about the Secret Service.
Yeah. Don't tap my phone, please. This is James Campbell. I'm begging you.
Donnie went on to say that Donald Trump is at the point he's so fragile and cannot ever begin any interaction in any exchange in any room where there's just not pure lionization, canonization, and it defies any left brain logic. This is a friend of the president's.
Who is running? Who's running the government? Nobody at the White House. That's bizarro land.
But what makes it so more bizarre is that Sarah Sanders goes out and says he revokes it because of irrational behavior. If that is the standard, let's yank the president's
But no breach of national security.
Yeah, there's been no breach of national
That
security.
was the best.
Yeah, no
I
breach
thought.
of national security, just irrational behavior. And well, we have it. We
There we go.
have it.
Yep.
All right, let's move on. It is truly a White House. With the firing of Omarosa Manigault Newman, I didn't even know she had other names. I thought she was just a one-name person. All of a sudden, we have three names.
Be like Madonna finding out that, or Cher. We
Yeah.
find out they actually, well, no, she was Cher Bono. That's
Yeah,
fine.
Cher Bono. That's right. But anyway, she's got three names now. With the firing of Omarosa, there appears to be no African Americans in the West Wing advising the president. But in fact, Omarosa didn't actually have an office in the West Wing. She was in the East Wing of the White House. Kellyanne Conway, if you didn't see her appearing on ABC's This Week when she was pressed by Jonathan Karl to name an African American who works in the West Wing, was the funniest piece of television I've seen in a long time. I hope you all saw that. She said, well, Secretary Ben Carson, who doesn't work in the West Wing, he has an office in his own building. And so when Carl pointed that out, she said, well, there's Georgsson. And didn't
Who also does not have an office in
the West Wing, and she didn't know his last name.
She did not know his last name.
Well, she
and
didn't say Tyrone, so she didn't go for the Tyrone.
Well, there is a guy named Georgsson. His name is Georgsson Smith. He's
That's
a
the
legislative
default
affairs aide.
name, right? Tyrone.
Well, Georgsson Smith is a legislative affairs aide who was on the list of people expected to attend a prison reform event with the president. That's it.
Well, you know, the way I see that is like it reminds me of one of Trump campaign appearances where he like looked out and go,
Where's
my African American?"
Yeah.
You know, singular African American, and it really, when you think about it, this guy is basically taking it backwards because every president, even George Bush, had African American and a more diverse cabinet of advisors and people that he could reach out to. This president doesn't even try. And I don't know where Ben Carson is. Ben Carson isn't in the White House, but Ben Carson is the most he is seriously incognito.
You call him sleepy, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, what have anybody heard from Ben Carson lately?
Yeah, I've heard from him because he is raising the cost to live in public housing on the backs, you know, poor people, and just doing all kinds of damage over there. But even his appointment to that cabinet position, I think, is racist. Okay, we need a black person over public housing.
Yeah.
You know, that's how that played out
Yeah.
in Trump's mind, I
Right.
think, because, you know, it's all casting.
A doctor,
right?
Who should have been over Health and Human Services, maybe. But
No,
he put in
yeah,
Tom,
well, he should
the
be
Price is Right.
sitting at home.
Yes.
You know, but the fact of the matter is, even when you say even George Bush, the black people that George Bush had in his White House he had personal relationships with them.
Yes, he
I
did.
mean, wasn't Kirby John one of them?
He's an
not
advisor.
stellar
Yeah.
example because of, you know, subsequent events, but there were others.
Innocent until proven guilty.
So black or brown or Asian, whomever. Bush had relationships with people and knew people, and these are people that he put in positions.
George Bush appointed more minority judges than Ann Richards did. Did you know that?
Oh, no,
I wrote that.
Well, it really took me back to my days back in Amarillo, Texas, when I think it was one of the first candidates forums I'd ever attended, and it was in an predominantly African American church in Amarillo, and they were asking all the candidates, so what have you done with the African American community? What connections do you have with the African American community? And this candidate, I can't even remember what he's running for, he thought, and he said, well, I had a boy who worked for me back at the plant, and I just nearly fell out of my pew. I just couldn't believe it. And then after he had finished speaking, this, you know, absolutely lovely African-American woman rose from her seat for the question and answer period, and she said, "What is a boy?" And that's the closest I've heard it come in a long time, with her trying to think and coming up with the worst answer that you possibly could.
It was amazing.
But in all seriousness, Chris Tritico, the thing that bothers me about this administration the most is that you don't have diversity, and diversity is not a bad word in terms of what you can learn from other people and how that helps you make policy. And you don't have anybody. Okay, before I got on the Chronicle's editorial board back in 1991, when I finally went to my first meeting and had, you know, talked to all my colleagues, I was the only African American on the Chronicle's editorial board. And I asked one of my colleagues at the time, I said, so when y'all wrote about stuff that was going on in the African American community, how did you do that? And he said, well, we guessed at it. And that
Literally.
That was insightful to me, because when you think about it, Trump, when he looks around the room and you want to talk about urban policy, or what do you do to try to bring people up that are in poverty in urban areas, you don't have one person that you can turn to. And
That black minister the other day said he's done more for the African American community than any other president.
I knew you were going to bring that up, and I wish I could go into my cussing preacher mode right now, but I won't do that.
You know, I thought
it's a great video.
I thought that when he hired Omarosa, and I resisted even talking about Omarosa on this show because I think she's an opportunist in and of herself, following this guy around all these years in doing what she's done. But hiring Omarosa in the White House was a slap in the face to every African American in this country.
Well, it should have been.
And she wasn't there to do anything for African Americans. She was there to do it only for Omarosa.
Yes.
And for Trump.
And for Trump. And he's getting exactly what he deserves today with her firing and the fact that she's got all these tapes and is going to come back and lash back at him because she learned from the master how to get back at people.
Yeah.
And she is going to get back at Donald Trump.
So at the NABJ convention year before last, Omarosa showed up and showed out. She just came in trying to defend Trump. And now there's a conversation going on in the black community about, well, should we give Omarosa her hood card back? No, you shouldn't give it back because this is a woman who's absolutely an opportunist, but this is an opportunity for us to learn something from someone who's allegedly a close Trump ally who has the goods, who has the tape. That's why Laura Trump offered her $15,000
a month
to do nothing. And so Omarosa, as you said, is absolutely an opportunist. But to put someone that doesn't have policy experience, doesn't have connections to the African American community, doesn't know anything about who the leaders are in each city. It's like, let's talk about Barack Obama. Barack Obama at least understood and knew who to go to when he needed to have a policy discussion about something in an urban area. Trump doesn't have that ability now, and that is a shame, and that's why diversity in the White House matters.
He didn't have it when Omarosa was there. You know, I'm not going to defend her because she's a terrible person, but I'm going to give her due. You know, she actually had government experience. She worked in the Clinton White House for Al Gore. She's not a dummy.
What did she do for Al Gore?
I'm not really sure, but he fired her. But
so did Donald Trump on The Apprentice,
three times
right?
now.
Yeah. So Gore sent her over to Commerce. But the fact of the matter is, Jared and Ivanka have no government experience at all. I mean, she actually
Yeah.
But who would you go to in the African American community now?
Okay, well,
isn't that part of the problem? There are all these divided voices and people saying all this disparate stuff, or do you think?
What do you mean? What do you mean?
Well,
when you talk about the African American community,
who are you talking about?
We actually, who are we talking about? And number one,
B comes next.
What people don't understand about the African American community, that there are factions of the African American community. There are some African American conservatives, there are a bunch of progressives, and there are traditional Democrats. So in the African American community, it's changing the dynamics. The black minister used to be the point person in the community, but not as much as it was years ago when you ran for office, Chris.
Wait a minute.
Now,
I don't even buy that. I think that was a black minister was someone who's acceptable to the wider society. But we've had all kinds of leaders. What was that?
No, there were a lot of community leaders were ministers.
Yeah, but a lot of them were not. But just because you guys didn't know who they were doesn't mean that they didn't exist.
Yeah.
And wait, can I just give me a second?
Okay.
Give me a second.
All right.
Who are the white leaders? I mean, who are the leaders in the white community? You know what? That is just
Donald Trump.
That's an insane question. We're not a community. We don't all live together in one neighborhood that stretches across America. We are individual people. We are a diverse group of people. We have as many different opinions and kinds of people as any other group.
Yes.
Any other
So
ethnic
if you
group.
would have asked me that question in the white community,
then why can't Omarosa?
In the white progressive community, you have people involved in the environmental movement, people involved in the women's movement. So if you want to reach white business leaders, you go to the Greater Houston Partnership, right? So
in Houston.
In Houston, and I would venture to guess that would be in any other community. But if you are talking about the black community where people go to congregate, a lot of times in years past, that's different now. It would be the black church, because the black church was the place where black people could go and have private conversations about white folks.
So let me ask this, though. I think you make a very valid point, Andi.
Thank you.
But with that said, then why do people jump all over the White House, whether it's this president or any other president, for not having black representation if there is no one to represent a group that diverse?
Well, because I feel like people look at the situation in totally the wrong way. You don't say, okay, we need a black person, we need an Asian, we need a disabled person, because that is not inclusiveness. That's tokenism. And no one person can represent every black person in America to a president.
I absolutely agree. Like when I was working as a journalist, this is another example. Somebody asked me, well, we have this issue going on in the neighborhood about banks not investing in African-American communities. And they said, can you go interview Cornell X or Robert Muhammad? I said, I'm not going to interview them. I'm going to go interview a black banker. I want to talk to someone who has an expertise about this, not what is
one or two people you are aware of.
But the Republican Party has basically staked their whole minority strategy on tokenism for
How's that working out for them in the black community?
Last 30 years. But what's interesting about it, though, the black community has always been so loyal to the Democratic Party. And I've always thought that, especially here in Texas.
That we haven't asked enough?
Well, yes, especially here in Texas, where you see the burgeoning Hispanic population and what have you, and they're not very monolithic in their vote. There are a lot more identifiable Hispanic Republicans that are out front and center, and they really make you fight for the vote a lot more. And the African American community has never done that as much, and I think as a result I think a lot of people see that they've kind of gotten the shaft a lot of times.
How do you suppose that black people ought to achieve this? Should we adopt a strategy where it's like, okay,
well, like
we're
those
going to have
ministers
everybody
going and telling Donald Trump how great he is?
Well, there's a start of a group right there. Because otherwise, are we going to say, okay, everyone whose house number ends in an odd number, you stay with the Democrats, and all you with an even number, you go with the Republicans, and we're going to pit them against each other? We cannot. To me, it's like
difficult.
When I see black people in the Republican Party.
But you just said there are a lot of conservatives in the black community.
I didn't say there were a lot. I said there are conservatives in the black community. And you got me saying the black community. We're not a black community. We're not urban. We're not, we're just black people. Okay? So, well, I lost my train of thought again.
but I want to make one
you just got so outraged.
I know. Wait, Campbell, let me just make this real quick point. Anytime I see a black person who identifies themselves as a Republican, I feel about them the same way I feel about gay people who self-identify as Republicans. I do not understand this log cabin Republican. That is an oxymoron to me. Why would black people want to be part of a party that really doesn't want to have anything to do with them?
There's only one thing worse. A gay black Republican.
Yeah. But Chris, before we move away from this issue, I want to talk about these job numbers that Trump talks about when he's talking about how he's bringing
just about to bring that up. Yeah. Go ahead.
They throw that out like nobody's business.
Yeah, but they're lying.
Yeah, that's an absolute straw man. Right. Because it goes back to a conversation we had on a previous episode. Y'all can just subscribe now and listen to it. But when you talk about the jobs that these people were getting, you still have income disparity, number one. You still have, people who, aren't getting jobs that will bring them out of poverty. Right. And at the same time, you have the administration talking about cutting programs that will help people in these conditions. And
Yeah,
so
and then coming out saying that Donald Trump has created more jobs for African Americans than Barack Obama created during the same period of time, which is an absolute falsehood.
Well,
And
Sarah
complete
Sanders
falsehood.
did come out and say that she was wrong on those
After the media,
hallelujah.
after the media came out and said that's just completely
Yeah,
wrong.
yeah. Well, usually this administration admits no
Yeah,
error.
but the strategy that the Trump administration has with respect to minorities, is, and particularly African Americans, is just to keep coming out and saying blacks love me. And Rasmussen came out with a poll that said that African Americans,
bogus.
Chris,
36%.
apparently it's not winning Andi and James over.
36% of African Americans, and the president just keeps coming out, blacks love me, and they think that's going to work, and it's not.
No, that's totally bogus. When you have those kind of false posts, okay, so let's look at, I mean, we could have a whole discussion about polling and how,
We don't want to talk about the polls you frequent.
Oh yeah, I like those polls. But anyway, I'm
He's through with that.
I'm a reformed man now. I don't go to those places anymore. You know
We
that.
gotta move on.
Lakshmi listens to the podcast. In other words, wait. Okay, so I thought we were talking about Omarosa, and I just want to get out this one thing. People keep asking, does she have a tape?
200 of them apparently
that she can play in which the president, when Donald Trump uses the N-word. I wonder what is going to be the consequence of America hearing Donald Trump use the N-word. I've been telling everybody that I know that it's just a matter of time before he tweets it in a rage or in a fit, or when he gets to the point where he thinks he can get away with absolutely everything. You know what I think? I think nothing's going to happen. We have a pussy tape. That should have gotten him, prevented him from getting the nomination, but it didn't. So I think the N-word is going to, I think his base is going to love that, actually.
Yeah, I agree.
What does Sacha Baron Cohen say the N-word is now?
I forgot. What is it?
Okay, here's another thing about the N-word. People, white people love to have permission to say it. So when Kanye's song came out, I ain't saying she a gold digger, but she ain't messing with no broke N-word.
Yeah.
Oh my God, you never hear white people sing that lyric so loud. If they don't know any other words to that song, they know that one. I don't know.
All righty now.
All right, let's move on to the next topic. This kind of plays into the same thing we're talking about, the race card. In 2016 election of Donald Trump brought race back to the forefront in America, and it was kind of playing right off of Barack Obama's 8 years in the White House. Race and racial issues had been brewing throughout his presidency, and we've talked about the fact that when the nation elected Barack Obama, it kind of reawoke racial issues. There were conservatives who said that when Barack Obama was elected, that ended racism in the country because we elected a black president. And I've been. This is a question I want to pose, and we'll talk about this to start this topic off. With the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 64, the Voting Rights Act right after that, and the Fair Housing Act right after that, did it kind of start this lull of race of us dealing with race after that, where we just kind of let it? Well, we've done it.
James and I never stopped dealing with race
I'm not talking
the
about,
whole time.
I'm not talking about from your personal standpoint. I'm talking about from a governmental standpoint.
You're talking about whether the conversation from a governmental standpoint.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah,
dormant.
did we just kind of we've done it
to a certain degree? It did, but they were still states like Texas that were still under federal sanction for voting rights. Yeah,
voting rights.
Yeah. So, no, it didn't go dormant when that happened, and we certainly didn't enter a post-racial world when Barack Obama was elected because, people talked about the Tea Party was started, to back the taxes up. But I think part of the Tea Party movement, and one guy who, I forget his name, who left the Tea Party because it became more and more alt-rightish. And so once the Tea Party movement, which was allegedly, started because of, taxes and immigration and all those other things that they talked about that they associated with Barack Obama and a Hitler mustache, for crying out loud, and some of their pictures. And so when I used to talk to people about this all the time, it's like, we elected a black president. Congratulations. We still deal with, systemic and institutional racism. And until we deal with that, Chris, the conversation will continue, because what happened after Barack Obama was elected, you had, police shootings of black men, all of a sudden go up.
And they get found not guilty every time.
Yeah.
Virtually every time.
And so when the problem with that is that anytime Barack Obama as a black president or black man showed empathy for this, it wasn't because he was siding necessarily with the black community. He understood as a black man that could happen to any African American man.
He was acting as any leader of the country should act in the face of blatant racism. And I think that, many people think that he was overly cautious.
Yeah.
And I understand why he might, he might have been that way. But when you refer to the Voting Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act and the Civil Rights Act, those laws gave the courts the ability to address systemic racism.
Right.
So a lot of the work has been going on behind the scenes. And I was sort of joking when I said, well, James and I never stopped, thinking about race, but I'm also serious. So where the majority population has the luxury of not having to think about race on a day-to-day basis, the rest of us are confronted with it, and sometimes we're left to wonder, now, did that just happen? And other times it's just in our faces.
And now probably more confusing because you don't really know. I think probably the majority of people aren't racist, but there's still what we've seen. And certainly, I think there was a lot of hope after Barack Obama was elected that it may be post-racial. But what it really did was bring out a level of racism that I don't think I'd ever seen in my life.
And we didn't know still existed. We didn't know it was bubbling under there.
People didn't talk like that. And then I started hearing stuff that
dog whistle.
But
typically you can't hear a dog whistle.
And it's better that way.
Yeah. A year ago when the Charlottesville riot happened, Donald Trump made that horrible statement, all sides, if everybody recall that. Well, just the other day when the anniversary came up, he tweeted out, "We must come together as a nation. I condemn all types of racism and acts of violence. Peace to all Americans." And then I read an article this morning that he was being criticized for that tweet because he put in the words, quote, "all types," close quote. He's being criticized for that word, those two words, because what's he leaving out? Now, far be it for me to defend Donald Trump, but what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that statement?
Well, I think he's trying to say that, blacks can be racist and other people could be racist. But, there's a comedian who has a joke saying that brown is the new black. And so, for black people, we understand what the Hispanic community and the Muslim community or any person of color faces because, when you are a person of color, Chris Tritico, one of the things that people who are Anglo make you feel like is that you can't be American enough. It's like, you got to wear the
I get that completely, but tell me what's the difference between I condemn all racism or I condemn all types of racism?
Because they thought he was trying to dial in the reverse racism and how oppressed white people are in this day and age. And
when I read that tweet, I thought he finally said something right, and then I read this article today that they're still jumping on.
That's where he was really going on reverse racism. It kind of goes back to what Andi was saying previously, and that is, if I were to wind up in a strange neighborhood and ran out of gas and started walking through it,
I know James Campbell.
Nobody is automatically going to think that I'm there to do any evil and stuff. And there are still people that have these stereotypes of African American people or any type of minority group, and they're going to immediately go there. And so it's a very different thing, I think, that people live with sometimes.
You said so much in that hypothetical. Just the idea that maybe the only reason you would be in this strange neighborhood is that because you ran out of gas. Why are these neighborhoods not integrated?
Yeah.
You know, they're when you said it's almost a trope, and I know you did not mean it this way, Chris Bell, but it's a cliche, this idea of like, oh my God, don't want to run out of gas in the black neighborhood, in the scary black neighborhood. So first of all,
but
it
Andy,
shouldn't be.
A few years ago, when whatever it was, somebody had been pulled over, whatever had happened, and almost they interviewed a whole host of African American celebrities, and almost every one of them had some experience in a department store or there were countless examples of that type of racism.
Right.
No, I see the point that you're trying to make is that you don't suffer under that stereotype of that you're. But
Right.
This is what Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about, and writes about. It's the policing of the black body, and that there are spaces where black people don't belong, and when you see black people in those spaces, like let's say in an expensive clothing boutique,
Right.
and there's a black woman in there, that there is automatically a suspicion around that person, whereas a white person is just shopping.
Right.
And this is I
Regardless of how they're dressed.
That's what that's what I was trying to say in my obviously less than eloquent neighborhood example.
No, I think everyone's going to get what you meant. But
one more point before we move on for this. A Public Religion Research Institute poll conducted in May of 2017 found that more than half, 52% of white working class Americans believe that discrimination against whites is as big a problem as discrimination against blacks and other minorities. And this is exactly what Donald Trump played to. That's the demographic Donald Trump played to when he got elected president. And I was shocked that many people believe that whites are being discriminated against as much as any other minority.
Okay, well, say you come from a white working class family and you've worked hard and you got really good grades and you wanted to go to the University of Texas or the University of Maryland or wherever you want to go to school, and they have a program that basically has affirmative action, and a black person or Asian person got in before you, and then you found out about that, you would probably be a little bit pissed off about that. And that feeds into this whole idea that whites are discriminated against, when that's been a legacy of most African Americans and most Hispanics.
I guess, when I was applying to law school, I applied to a whole bunch of law schools, and a whole bunch of law schools turned me down. Not because I was white, because I didn't have the grades to get into those law schools.
Yeah.
And one of them was Harvard. I never expected to go to Harvard. I just wanted to get the damn rejection letter back so I could have a letter from Harvard.
You just wanted a lottery ticket, didn't you?
I just wanted the letter. I just wanted a letter from Harvard. Dear Mr. Tritico, thank you for applying. We're not letting you in.
But
we don't give a damn what color you are.
I think the extraordinary thing there, I couldn't hold back. But
you almost made it.
What I find very interesting is that when we had the affirmative action fight here in Houston years ago, and Bob Lanier was the mayor of Houston, one reason he, obviously as a white mayor, one reason he wanted to defend the affirmative action program for the city of Houston, he kept saying he heard how people talked in the country club locker room, and he knew that racism was still alive and well. And I thought it was sort of a fascinating insight. And he was right.
Yep.
And we've seen that play out all these years later. I hadn't, like we were talking about earlier, I didn't hear it as much. But also when that whole discussion was going on, it occurred to me that obviously there were a lot of white contractors who were arguing about it, and they were, sick of having to include minorities in the construction work and what have you that they were doing on the part of the city. But really, when you got down to the argument and you would be talking to people, I was the only person that really knew that I had lost a job to a minority and had been told basically that a television station back when I was in television needed to hire a minority. Their representation was very low, and I didn't care. I mean, it was very commonplace in media back at the time. The numbers were terrible, but it was so interesting because I think all these people sort of imagine this, this reverse racism coming up just because they're working around minorities now.
Well, when I hear that, I used to always hear that being in newspaper, but when you walk into the newsroom and you have to find the fly in the glass of milk, meaning the black person in the sea of white people, that just didn't ever hold any weight with me because as a journalist back in the day, I was always told we can't find enough qualified people. And so as a member of the National Association of Black Journalists, we had programs that trained minority wannabe journalists to be able to go into the newsroom and be ready for primetime players. One final point before we get off of this discussion. As a 60s era black man, I'm both hopeful about where we are as a country, Chris, because my kid came up in a United Nations kind of household and world where all his friends were black, Asian, Turkish. He had a United Nations roster of friends, and I'm sure, your kids and Chris's kids.
Mine too, right.
And so, I'm hopeful about that. But when you see these young white guys walking in Charlottesville, angry that something is being taken away from them, they're delusional. They're being misled because that is the kind of stuff that perpetuates itself in a household that says you're better than somebody. And when you don't have those kinds of conversations in your home with your kid and bring them up in a way that you have to make them feel like they are like everybody else and not better than anybody else.
But that's also because we live in Houston, and so in this incredibly diverse community. And I'll never forget, years ago, we hosted the NAACP convention here when I was in Congress, and I went and I was speaking to a woman an African-American woman who traveled a great deal for her job, and she said, you have to understand, you get off the plane in some of these cities and you look around that airport, and she said, is anybody home?
It's when I was walking,
nobody.
I was walking, I once flew into Salt Lake, Utah, Salt Lake City, and I got off the plane. I was walking through, tall black man. This white woman came up to me and she goes, you play for the Jazz, don't you?
Did you say yes?
I said,
I would have said, yes, I do.
No. But I was walking around Russia once, and the Russian kid walked up to me and said, Kobe Bryant.
You should. Yes.
So I've been
Want a picture?
I've been a basketball player in Utah and in Russia.
You got to learn to run with that, bro.
Yeah. You got to.
Come on.
You get gifts and all kinds of stuff. We got.
Let me say something
real quick
before we move on. Every time a white person thinks that the black person or Hispanic or whomever got the job, or woman who got the job that they didn't get, and believes it's because of affirmative action, and also the person who might have been told, well, you know what, we have 20 spots and 19 of them are white men, and we needed something different. They need to understand that, first of all, the person of color may have been better qualified than they were. But if the resumes were equal, that person who comes from a different community brings something to the table that this other person doesn't have and that business needs. And so, affirmative action is a dirty word to a lot of people, but let's not call it that. Let's just call it a sound business strategy to bring in people who know
Because America
different
wasn't
things.
willing to do it on its own.
Oh, well, and also, this
People
whole
hire
idea,
who they know.
I don't want to hear another word in my life, but I will, about reverse discrimination, because if your resume says that your name is Laquita and this other resume says that, this is Elizabeth, Laquita's resume is going in the trash. Far more, and there are sound research studies that show this. And so,
Unless the boss's name is Laquita.
You're listening to Al Sharpton Radio.
All right, let's move.
Laquita, the boss, is going to throw Elizabeth's resume
That's right.
in the trash.
All right, we're moving on.
Well, yeah, if it's at a black hair salon.
We have hit rock bottom on that topic. Don McGann, rat or patriot?
All
We're
right.
out of time on the show here, so let's get to this last topic here. Don McGann, rat or patriot? Don McGann, you know him. He is the White House counsel. He has been working with the special counsel Robert Mueller. He is, some people call him a cooperating witness. The president says that's not what he is. I gave him permission to go talk to Robert Mueller, so he's not a cooperating witness. He's just over there doing what I said he could do. So leave me alone. He's not a big deal.
You've talked a lot about this lately and about the way lawyers are behaving in this administration, and you practice criminal law, and I've never seen anything like this.
No, this is the craziest stuff I've ever seen.
Well, this was the Ty Cobb Dowd strategy.
So those
of,
guys
we don't
are-
have anything to hide, and so we're going to fully cooperate. And
those are the dumbest lawyers in America.
Well, what made them dumb is not necessarily the strategy. I don't know, but it's that they thought that Trump had nothing to hide.
Well, when you have a client like Donald Trump who you can't control, you don't open up the White House to the person who's the prosecutor. You just don't do it. You clamp it down and you keep everything. You get everything under control as best you can. And you don't say, I'm going to give you 1.6 million pieces of paper to rifle through, and I'm going to open up everyone who can come talk to you. You just don't do it that way. And I don't get it. I don't understand it. You don't waive your attorney-client privilege. You just don't do it.
But I'm beginning to wonder if they don't really understand what collusion is all about.
Well, nobody's ever read the conspiracy statute. That's for damn sure.
And it seems that they just all thought that this was politics and it was fine to be playing along with these guys.
Yeah.
And
they do not understand what they've done. What they've
having
gotten
these
themselves into.
meetings and what have you. And it's probably going to be fairly ugly.
Don
in the end.
McGann, we don't know what he said, but Don McGann has met for over 30 hours with Robert Mueller. I mean, they didn't have tea. This has been a long debrief. I've been in debriefs with the U.S. Attorney's Office and multiple times over my 30-year career, and 30 hours is a long, long debrief.
Yeah, and he went in there with a lawyer, too, to protect his ass. So, whatever he said to Robert Mueller has to be of some significance. It's yet to be known what that is. But if I were Donald Trump, I'd be worried.
Well, the president said it's no big deal because he's not a rat like John Dean.
Trump is
That's
more than
message
likely
sending.
wrong about that, but he's wrong about it. Matter of fact, if Trump says it,
It's probably wrong.
he's wrong.
Yeah.
So, look, when the news stories months ago, when we heard that the legal strategy was going to be that we were going to be an open book, we were going to fully cooperate, I thought it was, a strategy, and letting these people, cooperate was a tactic. The New York Times story, today, which is why we're talking about this, said that the legal team, the lawyers, actually believed that Trump had nothing to hide.
Right.
That is bizarro.
Well, it's obvious they had no idea what they were talking about.
But here, wait. And finally, I think that they thought, well, McGann is on our side, so let him talk.
Wow.
But he's not going to say anything that's going to be harmful to the president. And that's where they were wrong.
But seeing the headline and looking at the story, as an attorney, I was just going, what?
It's
I mean, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. But the saving grace for Don McGahn is that if if something happens and he can no longer practice law as a result of all this, he's the greatest name for a car dealership. Don McGahn Chevrolet. Can't you just see the billboards? It works perfectly.
He's clearly, he felt like that Donald Trump was setting him up to be the fall guy, and he was not going to have it. And he went in there and he said, "Here, I'll tell you what I know."
Everything. He went in there and spilled his
very
guts.
common legal strategy.
That's right. This was a poorly executed strategy by Donald Trump's first set of lawyers, and the reason that it was poorly executed is because they did not know the full story, because the president didn't tell them the full story, and they operated from knowing half the facts, and that's the problem. The Times story that you're talking about, Andi, is reporting that Donald Trump and Don McGahn rarely meet alone, and that they do not trust each other, and they don't speak, and that when they do speak, they have an argument, and Trump questions McGahn's loyalty, and McGahn calls him King Kong. Other than that, it's a great relationship.
What I don't understand is why he's still White House counsel.
Well, he does get the job done. I mean, he has ushered through.
That's true.
He has ushered through the ramrodding of federal judges all across the country.
That's right.
And Trump wanted that done, and he's getting that done.
And he's overseeing the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation process. So that's
he's getting those things done, and so he gets to stay. But they do not like each other. All right, that's it. That's it for today. Let's move into out of left field. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. So last week, two things happened. We had the passing of arguably the greatest female soul singer and one of the greatest singers.
Why female?
Period. But that's a good point. Thanks for stepping on my out of left field, my sister. So I will stand corrected. So you had two things happen. You had the passing of Aretha Franklin, who was one of the greatest singers ever. But a lot of people didn't know about her civil rights chops. She was born to a preacher and a civil rights activist in Detroit, who organized the 1963 Detroit Walk of Freedom ahead of Dr. Martin Luther King's March on Washington. And everybody knows Aretha Franklin's most famous song, Respect. And she said in her memoir, that song reflected the need of a nation, the need of the average man and woman in the street, the businessman, the mother, the fireman, the teacher. Everyone wanted respect. And I say that to say that last week, 300 newspapers wrote an editorial basically asking the American people to respect the media. And so with that, I say respect and rest in peace, Aretha Franklin.
I'm reading a it's kind of a graphic novel. I don't know. It's got graphics and it's a book, and it's called Your Black Friend. It's by Ben Passmore, and this book. I feel like in the beginning of the book. I feel like Passmore is writing this for every white person who has a black friend, and trying to let your black friend. Trying to say to you what your black friend would like to tell you, but just doesn't have the energy or wants to maintain the friendship, so they don't say anything. The problem is, I think that a lot of black people are going to read this book, Your Black Friend, but the people who need to read it, the folks who have a black friend, are not going to read it. So I am recommending this book for my out of left field this week.
Well, I purposely went after Andi because if you've listened to our previous podcasts, she is all over Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Is that how you pronounce her name?
Mm-hmm. I think that's how she
pronounces it. And so Matt
it.
Lewis from the Daily Beast wrote this great opinion piece this week that says, who's going to tap Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the shoulder and tell her it's time to take a breather for her own good? Before June 26, nobody had ever heard of the 28-year-old, but her stunning primary election upset over incumbent Democratic Representative Joe Crowley made her an instant star on the left. Since then, however, her performance has not lived up to the hype. Cortez incorrectly claimed unemployment is low because everyone has 2 jobs. Couldn't elaborate on her criticism of Israel's occupation of Palestine, and wrongly claimed the upper middle class doesn't exist. Then, in what might be described as her "I can see Russia from my front porch" moment, Cortez claimed that socialized medicine would actually save us money on funeral costs. As Ed Morrissey joked, who wants to tell her we're all going to generate funeral expenses at some point because we're all going to die, regardless of how we pay for health care? All this has happened in just a few short weeks. Ocasio-Cortez is still the left's it girl. Andi, you don't have to feel bad. You're with the mainstream there. It girl of the moment, but she's 1 or 2 gaffes away from gaining a very different and difficult to shed reputation in more mainstream circles. It's hard to say when someone will hit the tipping point, but she's nearing the political equivalent of that moment when your friends hide your car keys and drag you off the dance floor. Yet nobody is willing to give her the honest advice she really needs to hear. Not all fame is good fame. You have the potential for a very bright future. Don't blow it. Take your time. Avoid overexposure. Bone up on the issues. Do the hard work. There's no reason to be in a rush. The attention isn't going to disappear if you don't gobble it up right now.
Mr. Chairman, I would like an opportunity to respond.
Sorry, no response on out of left field. So I watch with shock what happens every week in our country, and it's largely brought about by our president in the things that he does and the things that he says and the attacks that he makes. And last week's diversionary tactic in taking away the security clearance for who did he take it away from? I forgot. John Brennan. John Brennan was not only a swipe at John Brennan, but it was a swipe at the First Amendment and a swipe at freedom. And in using a security clearance as a political tool to attack your political enemies as the President of the United States is an attack on the Constitution of the United States, and it's an attack on all of us and all of our freedom. And I cannot sit by and watch this happen in our country. I can't sit by and watch freedom be attacked this way by someone who claims to represent all of us. Is it an attack on our country, and we all must act in the ballot box in November. That's it for today. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. Please rate us on iTunes. Much thanks to Keegan DeLeo, our in-studio producer. We'll see you next week.